Well, good evening, everybody. I think we're all just about seated. It's a particular pleasure when we've got a standing room only situation at the back, but I think we've found seats for nearly everybody. Can I just extend a very warm welcome to everybody here this evening to Keele Hall, to the second of our Grand Challenge lecture series from the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences at the university in this term. A particularly warm welcome to our external visitors to the university. I know there's a number of you here today, staff of the university and students of the university, and particularly welcome to our consortial degree students from doing natural sciences and liberal arts programmes. I know there's a number of you here this evening as well, so welcome to everybody, and a particular welcome, of course, to our speaker this evening, Professor Andy Stirling. One of the nice things about what we really try and encourage with our speakers is that they don't just fly in by plane and then get whisked off 2 seconds later by taxi to the station or wherever they're going. And Andy's been really great. He's been here for a lot of the day. I know he's already engaged with a lot of you in discussion this afternoon, informally and through some structured engagement sessions. It's very much the way I know he works, and we knew he'd be really receptive to that. So thank you very much for what you've done already. For those who haven't met Andy, just a few words of formal introduction. Andy is Professor in the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, and he's co-director of the SRC STEP Centre. The STEP Centre is the Social, Technological and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability Centre. It's easier to say STEPS, I realise, while you've got the acronym, which carries out interdisciplinary global research which unites developmental studies with science and technology to reduce poverty and bring about social justice. The STEP Centre works to explore sustainability challenges in communities across the world to create better livelihoods and health outcomes for poor and marginalised people. And they do this by opening up different pathways to sustainable development. Andy describes himself, and this is from your website, so if you disagree then you might need to revise your website, so I'm going to quote a little bit here. But as an interdisciplinary, politically engaged researcher with a colourful history, again from your website. But I think if you listen to some of his background, I think it is interesting. It's a background with extensive interdisciplinary credentials that I think few of us in this room would genuinely claim to beat. He grew up in southwest England and in Singapore in the 60s and 70s, and undertook undergraduate studies at Edinburgh, starting out first of all in astronomy, and then shifting through to science studies, to a master's in archaeology, and then social anthropology. He then worked as a field archaeologist, an ecologist, and then a peace activist in the 80s, going on to coordinate the nuclear disarmament and energy campaigns for Greenpeace International, and then later serving on national and international Greenpeace boards. If that wasn't enough, to get there, on the way, he apparently worked as a building labourer, a laboratory technician and a hospital porter. He's worked in factories, on farms and as a mental health care worker. When he returned to academia, his doctorate at the Science Policy Research Unit was Science and Technology Policy, and has been there ever since 1995. And he formerly was formerly a research director of the Science Policy Research Unit and the Sussex Management School, and his current work involves research and postgraduate teaching on democracy, sustainability and science and technology. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Andy to speak to us this evening. I think in terms of long and big words, I think your title probably beats most of probably the history of our institute. We're having an interesting conversation earlier about interdisciplinarity, and I had the pleasure of meeting Andy a few years ago. Well, our worlds coincided. I have an interest in infectious diseases and thinking about risk and uncertainty in those, and Andy contributed to seminars that we were organising at the time. But I think we were discussing earlier that one of the biggest barriers to that to those cross conversations is actually about the language you use, the nature of the language, and understanding where each of us are coming from in our own silos within our disciplines. Whether Andy's done a lot to dispel that in his title, I'm not sure, which is Emancipating Transformations, Interdisciplinarity, Sustainability, and the Democratising of Progress. I really look forward to hearing that, but I know with experience from hearing from you, it all becomes very crystal clear very, very rapidly. So thank you very much, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Andy Stirling as our Grand Challenge Lecture speaker this evening. Thank you, Andy.
Well, thank you very much. No pressure there, then. I hope it is going to become clear. I take the point, and I will try to say something about that, actually. It's a very important point about language. It's at times like this when you wish your mum was there, because thank you for the generous introduction. I must visit my website again and do some work on it. So it is a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a privilege to come here. In fact, I'm full of trepidation, because I can't really believe I've come to Keele to talk about interdisciplinarity. Because what I knew anyway, and I found out even more having had discussions this afternoon, is you guys do it more seriously than most other places I can think of. Sussex talks the talk, but I think you should come down to Sussex and talk about it too, I think. But I hope you get something out of this kind of Sussex eye view of this thing that you're also wrestling with. And we don't claim to have really solved anything, but I can talk about some of the lessons learned in the struggle and why we're feeling it's worth making that struggle. So I'm going to start with the grand challenges, which I know is one of your organising ideas, and go from there to this emancipating transformations, by which I mean it's not about just these objects in the world we have to act on. It's about emancipating ourselves as societies in order to do that, in the process of doing it, and in particular, emancipating how we think about transformation itself. So that's why I talk about democratising progress, which may seem an oxymoron, but let's see. So let's get going. What's in the room? Interdisciplinarity. Well, that's pretty clear. There's an object. Why do we need to be interdisciplinary? Because we need to look at the object. Because objects look different from different angles. Sorry about the last one. And that may seem kind of obvious. It's probably got a sinking feeling. Oh, God, he's starting in the platitudinous way. But this is already too radical for most academic organisation as it actually is practiced. Because although people talk the talk of interdisciplinarity, so much of the work that goes on, and the higher you get in policy status, the more this becomes so, the more difficult it is to actually get it taken seriously that the world is different if you look at it from different places. What you think you see will vary if you look at it from different angles. And from this we can also address, I think, part of the point about the difficulties of social sciences, humanities in particular, when engaging with disciplines who, thank goodness they do, look out at geology, at chemistry, at physics, at biology, where the social phenomenon of society is looking at a physical phenomenon. Social science and humanities are unique in the social phenomena are apprehending themselves. So we don't have a view like this. Looks like this. It's the inside of an elephant. So when you are inside the phenomena that you're actually trying to look at, they look more ambiguous. They are more uncertain. They can be described in a greater number of terms with more nuance, because ontologically, sorry for the word, but it's necessary, one is more proximate to them. And I think although social sciences can be their own worst enemies for thinking up terms too lightly, this, what Giddens called the double hermeneutic, is one of the reasons why interdisciplinary work can be so tricky, but also so rewarding. So let's take a look then at the grand challenges with this in mind, because I have huge respect for the body of thinking going into emphasising how the world has some enormously intractable problems that we need to take seriously and address. Urgent problems, compelling problems, possibly existential problems. and the role that science can play in the broader sense to remind the world of politics, the much vaunted real world of politics, about the real world outside politics is crucial. So although I'm going to go on to say some things that may come over as a little bit postmodern, a little bit critical, this is a genuine, really serious commitment on which everything I say is based. That society, and politics in particular, need reminding that our societies, our cultures, our institutions lie within biophysical environments, which lie within fundamental natural laws. And that's a crucial thing on climate, or on biodiversity, or on marine pollution that needs reminding all the time. So I am a positivist in that sense. But the other side of the coin is this, that it is within societies and economies that cultures and institutions, like this one, provide the environments for the knowledge practices. Knowledge is produced, and I'm not just talking about academic knowledge, because knowledge takes many forms, but wherever it's produced, it is produced in practices and institutions inside society. In political ways, because everything that's social is political, so the inside is the only means from the outside that we get to understand these physical phenomena. The inside is the outside. So now I've gone postmodern, right? Now, you don't need to think this is a Zen statement, because you can actually make a thing where the inside is the outside, a Klein bottle. I think it's an underappreciated metaphor for this. That you don't need to have these arguments between constructivists or interpretive and quantitative positivist people in interdisciplinarity and argue about who's right. They're both right. Both are true. And we need, in interdisciplinary work, if we take grand challenges, environment, social justice, peace, seriously, we need to grapple with that. So, one point that arises from that, despite the importance of respecting these challenges, is that they are themselves subject to this dynamic. So when we hear the phrase grand challenges, and by the way, I could do this with other organising phrases around sustainability I'll talk about later, or the nexus, or other things too. Grand challenges. Is this about performing grandness, which is a very precious, discursive political commodity to be able to deploy in interactions between ourselves? Or are we actually about addressing the challenge, like it says on the tin? You don't have to look very deeply or very far to see there's a way in which this kind of language treats these social and socially mediated problems of the grand challenges into engineering. Invitations to engineering for people like I'm doing now, standing up on podia, being grand. Some recognisable, some less recognisable. This kind of performative thing is going on as well. The complexity, the intractability of these problems is turned into something simple and becomes a political resource justifying privilege, justifying why we have these kinds of social relations. So it's in good company. Everything we do is like this. Knowledge is produced in society under conditions which favour representing knowledge in certain ways. So the grand, that word again, narrative of progress. All societies have constituting myths. Modernity, globalising modernity as we live in it now, which is responsible for the grand challenges language, no matter what the culture. Nowadays, despite cultural, political divides in other respects are regarded as being very stark, nonetheless shares this language of progress. You can't stop progress. Our hope relies on progress. Science gives us technology, technology gives us progress, and whatever sector we're talking about is arising from this linear process. And if you are critical of whatever these incumbent knowledges and practices are producing, then it's not seen that you're critical of that particular energy technology or that particular biotechnology. You are anti-innovation in general, because it's so deeply ingrained in our understanding of science and technology. It's a one-track race. The only questions are who's ahead, who's behind, how fast shall we go, or shall we slow down? Not which way. But one thing that different disciplines will agree on, despite arguing like cats in a bag about the vocabularies and so forth is that is just deeply wrong as an understanding of progress. Progress, whatever we might mean by it, is like evolution. It's a multi-directional unfolding. It's an emergent process. So, for instance, in the practical application central to grand challenges around food, producing enough food to rectify injustice and address increasing population and so forth, and environmental degradation, there are a host of different innovation practices on the ground that could potentially help us with this. So-called genetic modification divides into many different types of application which have all sorts of different political economies attached to them. But there are also other techniques, many of which are not even technological at all, but they are nonetheless innovations. And in fact, in their settings, ecological farming, marker-assisted breeding, participatory breeding, open source sharing of seeds among farmers themselves, so that what works on the one side of the valley or the other side of the valley is more important, as it is ecologically very often, than some optimized seed from a remote laboratory in a different continent, which would then be rolled out homogeneously across very diverse ecosystems. So my point is, innovation cannot simultaneously be optimized in all these pathways. We need to lay in infrastructures. We need universities that teach things in certain ways. And these have the habit of locking us in to particular trajectories rather than others. And these mechanisms of lock-in are very well understood. Some of them are social, about expectations. If finance markets expect something to happen, they'll charge capital, they'll charge less for capital, it is therefore cheaper, it's more likely. Simply because finance markets think it's more likely. But history shows how sensitive unfoldings can be, like the QWERTY keyboard, to random historical chance. There's no powerful interest trying to preserve the QWERTY keyboard in a basement in Switzerland meeting every year. It just does it for 150 years through 5 different iterations of technology, despite the fact it causes quite serious office disorders. We can't get out of it. And where power comes in, and power is not a bad thing, it's just a phenomenon, it's a social fact, one of the most important ones, then lock-in intensifies. We have processes where government regulators are entrapped, captured, very well documented, I won't labour them, and even in competitive consumer markets, where the whole point is products are set out in the market. It's very well documented how consumer products, for instance, Windows software compared to other types of software, formats for audio and video, routinely markets will settle into something that everyone agrees is suboptimal, but everyone went for it because they thought everyone else was going to, and they didn't want to be left out. So we know these processes that have the effect of locking us in. Same in energy, while the UK at the moment is quite extraordinarily fixated on nuclear power. It's another talk. I'm quite an enthusiast for talking about that, but I should stop now. But you get the point. The point is that not all that is scientifically realistic, technically practicable, economically feasible, and socially viable will actually prove to be historically realizable. It's just like biological evolution. That's what innovation is like. And when we make decisions in any given sector, that the stakes are even higher than we think. We're not just about going fast or slow. We are cutting off entire futures. And so when sound science, evidence-based policy comes into this mix, singular disciplines, reassured by their certainties of what the framework should be, you get pictures like this. It's the same with qualitative work. There's nothing, at least quantitative sciences, you can go back and audit, as I've done for this purpose of this slide. A typical regulatory risk assessment, if it bothers to look at different options, which is very rare, will tend, in this most mature area, energy here, you see an apparently clear sequence. You're asking the question, what will be best? Sound science, evidence-based policy will, in any given instance, from a particular committee or a particular study, give you an answer. The point is, if you step back from that, and this is very rarely, remarkably rarely done, and look at the peer-reviewed literature, in this case, studies cited in policymaking, answering the same questions, what are the relative merits, in cost-benefit terms in this case, of different energy technologies, the number of studies on the right, the meta-analysis shows you enormous variability. The vertical gradations are 2 orders of magnitude apart. With energy technologies, the best available science disagrees about the simple question, what is the risk of XYZ technology, by 4 to 5 orders of magnitude, because there are different framing assumptions. So disciplinary conventions will impose a particular one, but there'll be disagreement about what they might be, and an equally reasonable, different answer can be obtained. And the way policymakers get the apparent closure is because they don't ask that question. They get it from a particular committee, the chair may be a bit heavy-handed, everyone's after an OBE. That's what happens. And I've seen some of this up close. It's not pretty. So, the realities of innovation, of change in society, we get this illusion about there being the way forward, a singular trajectory on which we can, all the discussion is about how fast we go and who's ahead and who's behind, which happen to be the trajectory supported by the loudest voices. So, for instance, in agriculture, and this is not a criticism, it's just a fact of life, businesses aren't there as charities. In fact, they are legally bound to make shareholder revenue for their... We have a legal system in which in most countries, CEOs of companies are legally obliged not to consider anything that doesn't bear on shareholder value. So they look at IP, they look at market share, they look at economies of scale, and the particular trajectories that offer them the best private benefits to discharge their legal responsibilities are the ones that get locked in. So you find pharmaceuticals much more highly invested in than preventive strategies. You find IP-intensive agrotechnologies much more intensively invested in than you do ecological practices or new ways of organising farmers' collaborations. That's why. I'm not romanticising the Cinderella options that are left out. They might not work in some situations, but we know it's not controversial to point to these mechanisms. Likewise, when we talk about transition, there's a huge body of work, a lot of my colleagues work on it, transition theory. We see this word grand again, the transition, as if sustainability is a single thing, we've got to transit to it. This singularity is again performed, even when we think we're being critical and challenging incumbency, saying, no, we don't want fossil fuels, we want the energy transition, as if it's one thing. And we have manuals and roadmaps. Here's one from the European Union quite recently, where it's quite convenient to my argument. Actually, on the cover of the document appeared the questions we're allowed to ask. We're allowed to ask at what cost and what speed, but we must not ask which direction. So these pressures operate on knowledge in ways that are all the more powerful because they're not interrogated. Because the disciplinarity typically doesn't extend far enough to be reflexive about, hang on a minute, what's our environment doing? Everyone can reflect on it. Usually in the pub, you'll get discussions like this among anyone. So it's not that people aren't appreciating it, it's just at the formal table where the government and the research councils are assigning money, you don't get this sort of language used. And then we get a situation like sustainability, which I'll talk about in a moment, becomes in a new form in the last few years, the Anthropocene, characterised by the imperative to planetary management. Planetary management, a routinely used phrase in the grand challenges world. So what is that about? Well, it's about managing the entire planet, of course, because we've obviously been such a success in managing ourselves that we should now take on the next challenge of managing the whole planet and make that as successful as it's a cabaret style that's making me go into sort of stand-up mode. So we see language like the non-negotiable control variables of the Earth. There is absolutely no uncertainty. These are from papers in Nature and Science from the leading protagonists of this literature. Humanity is a control force acting on the control variables of the Earth. We went from environmentalism, friends of the Earth, to this. This is the underpinnings of the grand challenge style literature. And where that leads is very clear. This isn't an esoteric postmodern discourse analysis. It leads to, for instance, planetary engineering, climate engineering, what is explicitly referred to as, instead of climate change, whereby what I remember when I was in environmentalism more intensely and did campaign on this in the 80s, among the first organisations to do so, it was about let's stop messing the planet up. Let's stop chucking billions of tonnes of pollution into the atmosphere. Not let's modulate the temperature, as the IPCC now says, within pretending we know about the temperature. Just let's stop messing it up. Let's get our own house in order. Now we see the phrase, must maintain optimal Holocene conditions. So it's no longer just about not messing the planet up. It's about, and taking control of the planet in order to make it optimal for us. And that's regarded as environmentalism. So, of course, grand challenges are a very diverse field. It's not all about this, but I'm worried about the grandness of the grand challenges. There's a danger of reducing what should be, and in fact has been, democratic politics to elite expert engineering. And in making this critique, I am not saying that the various forms and modalities of power that are involved in this are a bad thing. Power is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends what it's doing. But one thing we can be pretty confident about is that power of all the kinds I've referred to is much more likely to be negative for more people when it is not challenged. And when, as in a lot of these science discourses, it's not only not challenged, but not even discussed, then we are in jeopardy indeed. So, the final part of my talk is about what we should do about that, because it's not enough simply to critique. Critique is only useful when it informs an idea of practical action, I think, and those can take many forms. It's not self-evident what this might mean. And in fact, I'm struggling to work out what it means and welcome criticism on that. But one of the things I think we should pay attention to is thinking about sustainability, where the grand challenges, Anthropocene, planetary boundaries, nexus, this engineering, more technocratic language we now are more familiar with came from, was from collective action. Collective action based on highlighting complexities, humility, ambiguities, uncertainty. A picture of change, much more like this Icelandic beach. It's not that NGOs are humble, far from it, often among the least. But the collectivity of civil society contending in horizontal ways for transformation or transformations is a more mutual thing than the top-down planetary control pit, cockpit, that is now the metaphor which planetary boundaries and grand challenges tend to, the dashboard that's in the cockpit of the grand challenges. So let's just think about sustainability, because it's remarkable that alongside this other tradition that I've been critiquing, the Sustainable Development Goals have revived in an extraordinary way. And you have this resolute refusal to reduce, often criticised. It's too complicated. There are 17 goals, there are 169 targets, many more metrics and indicators. But this is remarkable. It is saying something about direction, but it's plural. There's lots of room for... It doesn't squeeze it out with this singular assertions of sound science. And where it came from is crucial. It came from political action on social equity, the pillars of sustainability, social equality, human well-being, ecological integrity, all came out of decades of struggle, political struggle, not policymakers acting on evidence base. Brundtland did a wonderful job of synthesizing that in the committee originally, the Commission, the three pillars, which are now embodied in these Sustainable Development Goals. And crucially, it wasn't just about identifying the broad orientations for progress. No longer in this view is progress just something that happens. Let's just put money in the innovation system and whatever comes out is progress. It's like, now, hang on a minute, we're not just going to exercise social agency over going fast or slow, we're going to say what direction, broadly. That's an extraordinarily important thing. And also emphasising, as Brundtland did, and has been the case in this tradition, since its inception, emphasising citizen participation, greater democracy, that word. And it's not just in that level that sustainability came from political action. All the constituting problems. Again, there's a danger of making too cheap a point here, but I think to a first level of approximation, it's not controversial to point out that canonical environmental issues, for instance, like pesticides, asbestos, radiation, ionising radiation, heavy metals, carcinogens, chlorofluorocarbons, endocrine disrupting chemicals, these and many other examples, all, when they began, were highlighted by social movements, workers, local communities, environmentalists, and repudiated, rejected, vilified, excluded by precisely the institutions of academia, of government and of business, who now, in good faith, take them on. So this isn't a told-you-so point. It's just, remember where these issues came from. It wasn't from evidence-based policy being presented to policymakers and then it being decided, here's an optimal solution. Likewise, the responses themselves. The things, again, we disagree very much about what does offer the basis, and I welcome that, for a sustainable future, for addressing the grand challenges, if you like. But ecological farming, renewable energy, super efficiency in the home and in industry, closed cycle production, whilst there are different degrees of interpretation and optimism for these different things, it's not controversial to say these are central to achieving these challenges now. But they were not only fiercely resisted, they were totally ignored and vilified. Even when I began my adult life, it was ridiculous to be a proponent of renewable energy. So both the constituting problems as well as the solutions of sustainability depended on political resistance, political advocacy of alternatives, more than they did on policy making. Policy making played crucial roles, as it has done in the past with other transformations, progressive transformations. The end of slavery, such as it's been, decolonisation, such as it's been, women's emancipation. To the extent these things have been realised, the welfare state, gay liberation, to the extent these things have been achieved, and they have been transformative in the degree to which they have unfolded over the past century, they also were not, you can't tell a story that's credible that these were achieved by evidence-based policy, with policy, government, business, acting together with academia and deciding what the best thing was. They were fought every step of the way by those institutions against the political mobilisation seeking to achieve them. So why then, when we look at climate change or the grand challenges, do we somehow think these transformations, because we agree they're transformative on society, why would they be achieved in this completely different way? So what then can transdisciplinary mean? What can academia do? What can knowledge production do in a more general sense to enable this and to help the kinds of processes I've been pointing to rather than resist in the way that we've seen in the past? Because there are actually a multiplicity of practical methods for opening up political spaces rather than closing them down. And I've got a scheme here, I won't spend a lot of time on it, but if anyone's interested, there's various reports going through hundreds of different methods, where just distinguishing between methods that take into account relatively narrow things, their scope, the problems that they frame, the options they look at, the pros and the cons that they take into account, the issues that are seen as relevant, the degree to which uncertainties are recognised, the perspectives that are brought to the table. These inputs to research can be relatively narrow or broad. And likewise, the outputs of research can have the effect of closing down, saying, here's the answer. A typical global assessment will have many, many disciplines, huge variety of inputs. It'll be very broad in its inputs. But when it comes, like the IPCC, to give a recommendation to policy, it is massively closed down. Here's the answer. And if you don't doubt it, look at how big our report is. It's enormous. So they don't go together. And one can be narrow and open up, and one can be broad and closed down. So I'm interested, and by opening up, I mean acknowledging that the answer, like the elephant in the room, depends on the angle you look at it from. It's not really rocket science. It's just looking at elephants. If you take framing assumption X, then it follows that A. And if Y, then B, even if you're looking at the same phenomenon, food production in this particular region, you will get different answers about what would be best or worst. And different methods vary in the extent to which they deal with this. Any given method can be implemented in different ways, so it's important not to be simplistic and just name call. For instance, decision analysis can give you a picture, like I mentioned, of apparent, clear, precise orderings, or it can be used with sensitivity analysis to show variations like this, or it can be used to pick out under what particular perspectives it looks like different options are better or worse. You can do that. Usually we just aggregate, but you can do that. Likewise, consensus conferences, citizens' juries, needn't be just about consensus, about cranking out consensus, but about exploring the reasons for disagreement and learning from that. But my point here is, there are a vast array of methods. I'm not ending up prescribing any of them. I'm just saying, let's look at the ones that have the effect generally of broadening out, opening up. Because power works here, not as a bad thing. Power needs justification. It's a very difficult job, being a senior politician, a business leader, an leader of an NGO for that matter. The most precious commodity you can have is closure. Partly, if it goes wrong, you're not to blame. Someone else carries the can. They told you that was the right answer. It's very precious. You foster trust. You achieve what the Phillips inquiry called sedation. The public think he's very sure, usually it's a he, and it follows, you get greater acceptance. So these tools, we know why they're accepted. Cost-benefit analysis, risk assessment, optimizing models, engineered consensus. They're not bad, and there are situations in which they can be useful, but the reason they're so privileged in academia and academic research addressing grand challenges is because power is most interested in closure. It's not so interested in being right. So rather than controlling analysis of the kind I've slightly colourfully characterised with my little logo here, there is what you could call caring intention. Instead of control, it's about care. It's that root, the Friends of the Earth kind of root. I'm not a member of Friends of the Earth, so I can say that without being too cheesy. There are plenty of techniques that can do this. That's not why we don't do it. We do it because of the effects of power. So again, that's where the real nature of transformative change come from. Society is not like an aeroplane with a cockpit. It has no cockpit. We pretend there's a cockpit because that's what makes it possible to sustain privilege. We understand this. It's not necessarily a bad thing. That's why we talk that language. Society is much more like flocking behaviours. And when the time is right, it moves very, very quick. The question is, how do you make the time right? How do you achieve a phase change? And the way you do that is by myriad little actions. That's how the phenomena of the past I mentioned. How can, then, disciplines like our own contribute to that, to knowing doings, helping to move us in that flocking movement that, when it works, can be phenomenal, and we've seen it in the past. So then, finally, to look at disciplinarity in those terms, and I'm again not denigrating any of the forms, but multidisciplinarity, the classic form of an international assessment, an integrated modelling exercise, takes this form. There is an organising discipline, the equilibrium model, the utilitarian economics, neoclassical economics, which then organises the other disciplines. So they're in there, but this is your job, this is your job, this is your job, report to us, give us the inputs, and we'll crank out the answer. That can be useful under certain situations, but let's be knowing about it. Interdisciplinarity is crucially more mutualistic. The disciplines interrogate each other without that same dominating power relation. They are free to ask difficult questions of each other in ways that don't happen in a typical global assessment, where the modellers have to then really look at the entire modelling exercise more critically because of what people engaged with in the outside world are saying. And transdisciplinarity is when the power relations are relaxed not only within academia, but with the outside world, with the people, the most marginal, the most vulnerable people who often know most about their circumstances. The pastoralist whose environment is drying out, who's trying to tell you that we know what happens when it dries out, this is what we do, but we can't do it anymore because you stopped us. The women, the poorest farmers, the workers. Engage, these groups have knowledge that's very salient. It's transdisciplinarity, going beyond academia, that enables us to do that, to engage with that. So, in conclusion then, this is what I mean by democratising progress. Moving from a situation in which there's supposedly one track, it's usually technology-based, we look at it, if at all, very narrowly, we give closed-down answers to politics which reinforce lock-in. And instead I'm saying we can do it differently. We can appreciate the multiplicity of pathways for progress, look at them more broadly, take into account a greater number of issues and options than we normally do, acknowledge that the answer you get depends on how you look at it, so open up the inputs to policy making, deny powerful figures closure to the same extent, and nurture diversity. And in doing that, I think we reconcile the apparent contradiction between science and democracy in the first place, which is actually science itself was originally about challenging power relations in knowledge production, about peer review, about open production. But when you see the Royal Society in some of its reports nowadays, it's a little bit difficult to remember that. Thanks very much.